Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of CantoSense. We are here to navigate through the Chinese culture so that we can live fully Christian and fully Chinese. So I'm sure you've read in the news recently, and by recently, I mean the past few years, that a lot of cases have come to the surface about toxic leadership within the Christian circle, be it churches, ministries. And it begs us to ask the question here at CantoSense, well, specifically in cultural Chinese contexts, when the leaders are cultural Chinese or when the organization is in a Chinese context, are there certain values in Chinese culture that maybe inadvertently contribute to toxic leadership if left unmonitored? We're not here to say that Chinese culture creates toxic leadership, full stop. But left unchecked, what are some ways in which we can easily fall into some of these pits without knowing it? So we're born with these Chinese cultural values, and then we meet Jesus and he brings his set of values, and that's supposed to transform us. But if these things are still happening so prevalently and to cause such a degree of damage, it makes you wonder, how transformed are we at the cultural and values level?
Is not the values that are wrong because we live in a fallen world. How we live out these values is where redemption needs to happen.
We are honored to have a guest join us today. Now, due to the sensitivity of this topic, our guest will remain anonymous. We want to give a warm CantoSense welcome to Mary.
Mary, can you tell us briefly of your experience and just maybe help us understand if cultural Chinese values and orientation played a role in how your situation turned out?
Sure. It all started with a difference of opinion with my immediate boss over ministry strategy. And by the way, my boss wasn't Asian. Unfortunately, he tried to resolve the situation by pressuring me to resign. My colleague and I felt that this was not acceptable, and we escalated immediately the incident to our boss's boss, who is culturally Chinese. He at first responded sympathetically to us. He assured us that we had done nothing wrong and we still had a bright future with the organization. But under pressure from our immediate boss, furious that we were not fired, the Chinese leader then made a complete reversal and basically made us pay the price for the incident. At the same time, our immediate boss was not held accountable and was protected from dishonor. I was pushing for mediation because I felt that resolution was the correct Christian thing to do. But my boss was allowed to refuse to participate in any mediation process. And not only that, he continued to be invited to important meetings and to speak and to preach. But at the same time, me and my colleague were forced to stand down from our ministries, and we were barred from active service for a time in order, it was said, to reflect. Even after we obediently served our time on the bench, we were never given any role of influence. And eventually we both resigned.
Were there any questions from people around, and how did your leaders respond to why you guys were put on the bench?
There was not transparency, and we were sworn to secrecy from the start. Other people who didn't know what was happening just kept quiet and didn't ask. They knew something terrible had happened, but they didn't want to know. Some people even shunned us. They were just too embarrassed to talk to us. They didn't know what to say to us.
It's just classic shame, honor context.
But then there's a huge snowball effect here too.
Exactly.
It starts with the inner layer of the people involved, and then there's shunning there, and then there's shunning with the rest.
In your own process of working through the pain of what had happened, what were some of the things that were going on?
I think at the root was a lot of insecurity, fear, lack of courage, inability to do the right thing. I don't think the fact that cultural Chineseness was in operation was at the root of it, but it got into the mix. The insecurity plus the shame, honor component kind of fed each other and kind of created an even bigger monster. If people were operating with such insecurity and fear, even if they were culturally very different, things would still not work out well. How it played out was very cultural. The high shame and honor component. There was also a lot of high power distance happening.
Power distance is the degree of power each person exerts or can exert over other persons. Power being defined as the degree to which a person is able to influence other people's ideas and behavior.
So we obviously were the people with no power, and the people in power had to be protected and had all the say. We had no voice. We were pretty helpless, and the only way we could get anything done actually was to appeal to other people with power. There was very little regard for justice. I don't think that in a shame honor situation that necessarily has to be the case. But it so happened that there was just no value placed on justice. And then when you combine that with a very shame honor dynamic, we make the small people pay the price, and we save face at all costs.
Even if there was a regard for justice, the whole protecting the honor of people trumps that.
It's very simplistic to say, oh, this cultural behavior is bad or that cultural value is good. Everything is very dynamic. Even though the Chinese Confucian cultural values really escalated everything and made everything so much worse. I don't think Chinese Confucian values necessarily had to result in that. The high power distance that was in operation could have been used for good. We could have brought in someone of extremely high power and position to tell my immediate boss, look, you need to submit to a Christian mediation process. You can't just shirk the responsibility of trying to find a resolution. In a high power distance context, you could have still insisted on justice. The person with the high power could have said, but I will use my power to make sure that they don't pay the price, that they are not bullied, that they are looked after.
You really have taken the point that we were going to make about just redeeming these cultural values, because they in themselves, not all of them are bad.
It sounds like it's even harder to navigate when they're choosing different levels or different degrees of power distance based on convenience. So when it's convenient, let's use high power distance. When it's convenient for my ego, let's use low power distance. And we'll just keep changing it up, based on what we want to do, and how do people follow that, whether it's right or wrong, but at least be consistent.
At no point was it ever admitted that high power distance was important and at play. And in fact, all the language was low power distance, and all the language was actually guilt innocence rather than shame honor. But at that time, in Christian circles, leadership development thinking was very much influenced by the West. So you would go for leadership training and you would even hear things like, a good leader does low power distance. Nobody talked about godly high power distance leadership, how to do shame and honor in a godly Christian way. It was just the assumption that to be a good leader, you must do it the low power distance way. So that was what we were hearing, and that was what was being said, but that was not what was being done.
And that makes those who are following leadership so confused and questioning their own judgment, because you have the rules of the game changed without telling anybody. It's not based on principle.
I don't think the leaders themselves know that they are speaking a different language and really living out a different set of values.
I almost could have wished that they had told me from the start, look, you brought shame and you therefore have no more future in this organization. If they just had said that, I would still be very upset. I would probably still need counseling, but I think, the pain could have been over much faster rather than me having to hang around to figure out what on earth is happening. There was no remorse, no shame for what they did. And I don't think they even realized that they had a complete lack of integrity.
Based on your reflection, one or two things that we can really learn from your experience?
There needs to be more discussion about leadership in different cultural contexts, and an understanding of what leadership looks like in your non-preferred cultural dynamic. There is a way of doing high power distance leadership that does serve your followers. It's not wrong to operate under shame and honor, to try to save honor, to try to avoid shame. Then I think they could have been more self-aware. And if you're more self-aware, I think you're more in control of your actions, be less emotional. There needed to have been a more sophisticated way of dealing with shame and honor.
In protecting the honor of your immediate boss, it led to shame upon you. I mean, it was just sort of passing the shame around, like we don't want it to land on this person, so let's just pass it off onto the next person, right? So someone has to pay the price and be shamed in the end.
When we talk about toxic leadership, the long-term repercussions would be it actually cultivates a toxic culture in the organization or in the team, even though it's supposed to be sort of private, but everyone knew what was happening. They then know what I should or shouldn't do because I don't want to end up like her. And this creates this whole fear that keeps the team together. And that's not healthy. And that's very toxic. There's just so many repercussions that could come from just one incident.
To anyone who finds themselves in a similar situation, I would want to say that it's really okay to walk away. The one big mistake I made was I stayed in the environment. I thought I was a terrible person. I really thought I had done something wrong. I felt that I had a need to save the situation and to redeem my name. So I stuck it out, even though the environment was very toxic. And now that I've left it, I don't know why I stayed for so long. You are not required to save the situation. God will deal with the situation. Amen. God will deal with those people. You can't fix them. Take care of yourself and just walk away.
Amen. Thank you so much, Mary, for joining us.
Often in our culture, Chinese culture, we've been taught to persevere. We've been taught that it's shameful if you give up, it's not honorable. We need to serve sacrificially no matter how much suffering you have to go through. And
it's disloyal.
Or is disloyal. And there's a lot of truth and value to that. But you do need to come to a point, and there's a lot of wisdom that's required, a lot of discernment, and we don't do it ourselves. We do it in community with the people that we trust to pray with us, to walk with us through it all, and eventually come to a point where you say it is okay to walk away.
Next episode of CantoSense, we're going to have a second guest and somebody who is going to share from a different perspective, not necessarily from their personal experience as Mary did, but somebody who is seasoned and an expert in working with leaders to navigate through issues of toxic leadership. We hope you'll join us again. See you again soon. God bless.